It's great to see so many people at the first lecture. The challenge is always to see how many people come to the second lecture. So my job is to do a good enough job of presenting this information that you'll want to come back and hear more. And so you can make fun of the people who decided they were going to sleep in and get over their jet lag. So my name is Ross Arnold, as you may have picked up already. How do I come to be doing this here? This is the 12th cruise that my wife Carolyn, who's with the camera down front here, and I have been on, where I've been the lecturer. There are a number of you who have been on previous lectures that or previous cruises that I've lectured on. I asked Paul a few minutes ago how many different lectures he's heard me give. It must be 20, 30, 40. I don't know. It's a lot because we've been on a number of lectures, number of cruises together. So I am by training a theologian. In fact, more specifically, I'm a philosophical theologian, but because of that background, and I'm actually the pastor of a church in Mexico. My wife and I live in Mexico, south of Guadalajara. There's a large expat community down there. And but because of my interest in theology, and I began to teach on world religions, and so I felt the responsibility to learn not only about the beliefs of those faiths, but also the history and background. One thing led to another, and so I ended up developing some expertise in terms of history and culture of various parts of the world. And so that's why we're now in our 12th lecture, and we will continue all the way through to Seward, Alaska. So we'll see some of you all I think some of you are on for 2 or 3 of these next trips, and we will see you there. And then later on this year, we're going to be in Western Europe and Scandinavia, all the way up to the Arctic Circle. So hope to see some of you all on those trips as well. This is a map of where we are going, in case you hadn't already figured that out. Some of you, I think, may be just along because your spouse has booked this trip for you. But the marvels of China and the Japanese island. We are somewhere right along here now, having left Hong Kong. We are going to be passing by Taiwan and going to the city of Taipei in the north. This afternoon, I will be doing a talk called China versus China, in which I'll try to help you understand, if you don't already know, why we're going to be visiting 2 very different Chinas on this trip. The People's Republic of China, which is the mainland, and the Republic of China, which is Taiwan, and how it came to be that there was that split. Also a couple of other things, because this is a nice simple map. Of course, this is Japan, and then a string of islands that are owned by Japan. The Ryukyu Islands, which Okinawa is part of. But particularly, I want to just point out here, this is Korea, because we're not visiting Korea on this cruise. That's just sort of whited out there. This little thumb that sticks down here, just to the east of Beijing, that is called the Aldol Peninsula. And that's a very important historical place, and it's going to come into the discussion today and a little bit more later on as we talk about it. The Aldol Peninsula has been a very important piece of property in the whole history of this region. So my goal in the next 14 days is to give you an idea of some of the history that has created this region and how the cultures of the different countries, particularly China, Japan, and Korea, have affected that. These are the talks. I told somebody yesterday I thought it was 14. It's actually 12 talks I'm giving on this cruise, and then there'll be new talks for those of you continuing on to Yokohama. Today, we'll do China versus Japan, and then this afternoon, China versus China, the Chinese Civil War. We'll talk about the religions of Japan. I'm going back to my roots sort of on that one. That's something I've taught pretty extensively, the religions of East Asia and Southeast Asia. Then talk on the Pacific War, the Battle of Okinawa, and kamikazes before we get to the island of Okinawa. Okinawa was the last major battle of the Pacific campaign of the Second World War, and it was the bloodiest. More fatalities, casualties at Okinawa than anywhere else. We'll talk about that. But in leading up to that, I'll give you just a real quick kind of high points of what happened from Pearl Harbor to the point where the Battle of Okinawa occurred. Just 2 or 3. We're not going to be here all day. Then Islands of Tranquility. We'll talk about Japanese gardens and how they reflect the unique Japanese culture, and particularly the religions of Japan, which is why Religions of Japan comes in earlier, because that affects a lot of the other things we'll talk about in Japan. Emperors and shoguns, a brief history of the nation of Japan, a brief history of China, the religions of China. Then we'll talk about China's treasure ships. How many of you have read the book 1421 by Gavin Menzies? Okay, I'll talk a little bit about that. And fascinating stories. Did they or did they not discover America 70 years before Christopher Columbus got here? Then Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. Do we have any British citizens aboard? Anybody from Great Britain? Okay, I'm sorry. Because I'm going to be talking about how Great Britain actually went to war twice against China to force them to import opium when China didn't want it. So we'll discuss that. And then the Boxer Rebellion, which is a product of a number of other things, of anti-foreign feelings in China. We will talk about the Silk Road empires and how the Silk Road was the first and greatest, perhaps, ever of global economy being expressed. And then finally, the Great Wall, how it came to be, how it's been added to, what it's all about. Okay, so that's where we're going with these lectures. Unfortunately, because I'm only doing 45-minute lectures or so and then a time for questions and answers, I can't give all the details. If you've got any historians in the group, you're going to be very frustrated at how quickly I skip over some things. But that's just the necessity of the time frame we have. All right? Any questions about that? Where we're going? We good? All right. Let's talk about China versus Japan. And I want to start out a little bit in the middle of where we're going. This quite extraordinary portrait is a portrait from the 1880s of the Japanese Meiji Emperor and his family. The reason I'm showing this to you is you will notice that some, particularly the children, are wearing very traditional Japanese clothing. But the adults look very much like they could have stepped out of 1880s England. Very modern dress for the time. This was a crucial turning point in the history of Japan. And it's sort of, this is kind of the crux that I'm going to build on. Stepping back from that, in the early 1600s, Japan was controlled by shoguns. You've heard the word shogun. A shogun is a military leader. And for several hundred years, the military leaders in Japan ran the country. The emperors were only figureheads. The shoguns, who had their own army, and then they also had what were called daimyos, who were land barons, sort of warlords underneath them. All of them had their own samurai armies. That's where the samurai came from. Well, the shoguns were running things, particularly the Tokugawa shoguns from 1600 to the middle 1800s. They ran the country and they isolated Japan. The shoguns decided during that period of time, of over 200 years, that Japan was going to be completely cut off from the rest of the world. No foreigners were allowed, there was no foreign trade, no Japanese were allowed to leave. And so for over 200 years, Japan stagnated. It did not change. It maintained the same dress, the same culture. It was almost entirely an agrarian economy. There was no industry to speak of. And then, nosy Americans, we had to stick our nose into it. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed 4 of his American gunboats into Edo Harbor, which was the harbor what we know of as Tokyo today. And he insisted, because he had gunboats and much more advanced than any of the weaponry that the Japanese had, he insisted that he get an audience with the shogun. He met with the shogun, they allowed it, and he told the shogun that they wanted to open Japan to trade with the United States. The shogun refused. Well, a year later, 1854, Matthew Perry showed up again, and this time he had 7 gunboats. And he made it very clear that he was no longer making it an option. This was happening in a lot of different places. The British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese all had practiced what we came to know later as gunboat diplomacy, meaning coming into the harbors of these various countries, in Asia especially, and saying either you trade with us so that we can get financial advantage out of this, or we're going to attack your country. And we have bigger guns than you do. And so at that point, and this is in 1854, the shogun agreed, all right, we don't have any weapons like your gunboats, we will let you start trading. This did a phenomenal thing in terms of reducing the impression all the other daimyos, all the other warlords had of the shogun. They saw him as weak. And so over a short period of time after that, some of the other daimyos, the warlords, or daimyo literally means great lands. They were landowners that had their own armies. 2 of them especially, the Satsumo and the Choshu daimyos from the south of Japan, decided they were fed up with the shogun. So they got together and got other supporters, other daimyos, to put their armies together, and they fought a battle the Meiji War, and defeated the shogun. When they did, they turned to the emperor and said, "We want you to be in charge again." So it's called the Meiji Restoration because it was the restoring of the authority to the emperor who had only been a figurehead for over 200 years. This is the Meiji Emperor. He actually, when they started that process of throwing out the shogun in favor of the emperor, they had an older emperor who was not very strong, but his son inherited the throne during that process, and he turned out to be an extraordinary man. Dynamic, energetic, strong-willed, and so he started what was called the Meiji Era. Meiji means enlightened peace. And this man changed everything about Japan. Recognizing, having seen the American gunboats and other Western power, they had to change if Japan was going to do its business in all the rest of the world, if it was going to make an impression with the other powers in the world. So he did a number of things. He sent students and delegations to all the Western powers to learn how they did government, how they did military and manufacturing. He turned the country away from being a just agrarian economy to being a manufacturing economy. You don't think of Japan as being a great food exporter, but you know about all the electronics and machinery and everything else. It started there. He got rid of the class system. It used to be that below the emperor you had the shogun and then the daimyos, then you had samurai, the warriors, you had the farmers below that, the next down were the craftsmen, and the lowest of all classes were the merchants. Because in Japan they thought, you don't create anything, all you do is buy it and sell it. And they didn't value that very much. Later on the merchants became very powerful in Japan. Because when they changed to a manufacturing-based economy, then the people who were buying and selling this stuff were very important. So they introduced universal education for boys and girls. Massive changes, but there was a huge problem. Japan has very few natural resources. They have no oil, they have no coal, they have no iron in the Japanese islands. And so having made this change and starting to produce heavy weaponry, for instance, for their military and other kind of manufacturing, they didn't have the resources for that. They had to look somewhere else to try to get what was needed in order for them to continue to grow. But for 30 years under the Meiji emperors, Japan fundamentally changed and became a very significant power. Now, because Japan did not have any natural resources, they had to look around and say, where can we get the things we need? Where can we get iron and coal at that point particularly? Japan obviously is very close to Korea. Korea has coal and it has iron. At that point, the power in Asia was the Ching Empire. It was the last of the imperial dynasties of China. And the Ching Empire had been seen as the powerhouse in Asia, but unfortunately they had been defeated twice by the British in the Opium Wars not too long before this. And so they were a little shaky. And they had tried to modernize, they had tried to do what Japan did, but they were not successful. They simply could not change all of the traditions in order to be able to do what was necessary to become a modernized nation and a modernized military. So Japan looks around at Britain and at France and at the Netherlands and at all these other countries who were simply taking what they wanted. If they had the power, they would end up simply taking resources from other countries. We just were in Hong Kong. Why do you think that Hong Kong was British until fairly recently? Because the British simply took it over at one point. After some of the conflicts, the Boxer Rebellion, which is in 1900, I'm going to talk about that later, there was an 8-nation unified group that came in to stop the Boxer Rebellion, which was an anti-foreign. They were killing missionaries especially and foreigners. And of the 8 nations that came in, it included Russia and Britain and the United States. Many of them just took ports. They took properties. Germany took properties. After the First World War, Germany was punished. They took all their properties away from them, and the Japanese took part of them. And so they ended up with ports along the coast of China. The Qing Empire was weak, but still thought it was strong. So what happened is Japan started trying to work in Korea to develop relationships so that they could get the resources they needed. Korea was a tributary state, a client state it's called, to China. China was in charge, and the Koreans were simply sort of a puppet government. So when the Japanese started trying to influence Korea, they ended up creating a split in the Korean government. Part of the people wanted to stay with their connection to China. Part of the people wanted to go with Japan because they were tired of being told what to do by the Chinese. And so there was a mini sort of revolution going on in Korea. They went back and forth between, are the Japanese going to be in charge, are the Chinese going to be in charge? Well, what happened was, through a series of various conflicts, the Japanese would send troops in because of some little flare-up of some kind. The Chinese would send troops in, there would be skirmishes. Finally, they signed a treaty and said, okay, neither one of us should have troops in Korea, let's both leave. And neither of us can come in unless we ask the other one's permission. Later on, Korea was having a huge problem with a rebellion called the Tongpak Rebellion, which was a religious group, a cult, if you will. The leader of this group professed to be the younger brother of Jesus. And they launched a rebellion to try to take over the government. It scared the Koreans. They asked the Chinese to come in and help them quell this rebellion. The Chinese did that. Well, the Japanese considered that a violation of the treaty, so they sent troops in. The next thing you know, there is a full-scale combat going on between the Chinese and the Japanese over what's going on in Korea, over control of Korea. These are some images of some of the various events. At one point, the legation, the representatives of the Japanese government were attacked. Several of them were killed. They had to flee in a small boat. The Japanese considered that a major affront to their dignity as a country, and it got worse and worse and worse until finally, in 1894, we have the first Sino-Japanese War. The first war between China and Japan. So what happened, it involved, this is a modern map, but you get the idea how close Japan is to Korea. And this again is that peninsula I was talking about. Well, the Japanese landed troops in Korea, marched up through Korea, and took control of the Liaotung Peninsula, which is one of the places that there was a great port there called Port Arthur, and they wanted to be able to control that. It only took them 6 months to defeat the Chinese Ching Empire. In fact, it's interesting when you look at any of the images, both of these are images from that first Sino-Chinese War, they're paintings, but you'll notice that the Japanese military are dressed very much like Western soldiers. They had modern arms, they had developed modern techniques, they had brought in Western military experts to teach in their military academies for the 30 years prior to this. You compare that to down here in the corner, you can see the Chinese are very traditional. They're wearing traditional clothing. They were trying to fight with swords, whereas while the Japanese had swords, they primarily relied on guns. And so it was really unfair. But nobody thought the Chinese were going to be beaten by the Japanese. It was simply unheard of. In fact, Punch magazine ran this cartoon. You have the huge China with the tiny little Japan standing on his chest, because Japan defeated China in this war in only 6 months. It was really a rout, no question about it. So at this point, because the Japanese have won, the Chinese give them the island of Taiwan, which at that point was called Formosa. They give them a number of other islands around the coast. They give complete independence to Korea, and they give that very important peninsula, the Liaodong Peninsula that I showed you, they gave it to Japan. So Japan has won all of these concessions. Well, unfortunately for them, there was another party that really was interested in gaining more property and more power in this part of Asia, and that is Russia. This, of course, is prior to the Soviet Union. This is when Tsar Nicholas is still in charge in the late 1890s. Well, Nicholas really needed a warm water port on the Pacific Ocean. The home base for the Russian Pacific Fleet was Vladivostok. If you look at a map, it doesn't look too far up the coast, but Vladivostok is a cold weather port, which means it freezes in the wintertime, and the Navy couldn't use it in the winter, or at least they couldn't get out of there if they were there in the winter. So Russia looked at this and said, Port Arthur at the bottom of the Aldol Peninsula down in the Yellow Sea would be perfect for us. So Russia gets Germany and France to join them in convincing the Japanese, you can take everything else that you were given by the Chinese, but we don't want you to occupy the Aldol Peninsula. And Japan, while they were feeling quite proud of themselves for defeating China, were not willing to take on Russia, Germany, and France over this. So they backed off. 2 years later, Russia signs an agreement with China that they lease the whole Aldol Peninsula for 25 years. And they start building a huge port and fortified center at Port Arthur, which really ticked the Japanese off. The Japanese kept trying to negotiate with Russia. They kept trying to say to them, look, you can have all of Manchuria, give us control of Korea so that we can get the resources we want. Well, unfortunately, Russia did not think much of the Japanese. In fact, Tsar Nicholas was quoted as saying the Japanese were little yellow monkeys. He was clearly racist. He did not believe, he thought they were inferior human beings and therefore would be an inferior military force. And he thought, I can tell them to do whatever I want, and if they don't like it, we'll just defeat them in a war and there's no problem. Well, Japan kept trying to say, give us Korea, you take Manchuria, which the Aldol Peninsula sticks down from the province of Manchuria, and the Russians wouldn't even talk to them. In fact, the Russians insisted that they control northern Korea down as far as the 39th parallel. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. The 38th parallel was where North and South Korea got divided. But all of that started because Russia said, we want to control the northern part of Korea down to the 39th parallel. Japan got frustrated because Russia wouldn't even negotiate with them, and so they attacked. These posters, which were from Russia in that time, I'll try not to fall down, give an idea what Russia thought of the Japanese. Here you have a Cossack who is whipping a Japanese sailor. Here you have a Japanese ship having his nose bloodied by a Russian ship, a Cossack looking down a little tiny Japanese soldier, etc. They thought this is a non-issue. So I'm actually talking about 3 wars here today, 2 Sino-Japanese Wars and 1 Russian-Japanese Wars, or Russo-Japanese Wars. So, the Japanese, fed up with trying to negotiate and not being listened to or respected, decided to attack Port Arthur. This is the Aldol Peninsula that I talked about, Russia, or the Korea, Japan, the Russian Empire. The Japanese attacked the Port Arthur in 1904 with a surprise attack on the port. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. The Japanese had a surprise attack on the Russian fleet that was in Port Arthur. Using mini submarines and torpedo boats, they immediately sank 2 of the largest battleships in the world. The Russians were considered to have one of the most powerful navies in the world. They had 3 major fleets. This is the Pacific Fleet. Well, the Japanese mine the harbor just outside the harbor of Port Arthur, and they have their gunboats out there, so that the Russians can't really leave the harbor. But the Japanese can't attack from the sea because the Russians have guns along the ridges overlooking the port. So the Japanese, because they can't attack any further by sea, they land in Korea, march all the way up the length of Korea, defeating Russian armies as they went. All of the Russian generals were just like Tsar Nicholas. They had no respect for the Japanese, and so they continually underestimated their power as military force. And the Japanese won battle after battle. They ended up, after going up through Korea, they came back down behind Port Arthur and attacked it from the landward side and took over the hills that had the artillery emplacements in them. They lost 500,000 soldiers as casualties. The Japanese had 1 million soldiers there, and they lost half of them to casualties. Not all dead, some of them were just wounded, but 500,000 casualties. Later on, this would be a factor because the Japanese, having lost so much blood in Manchuria, which this is part of Manchuria, felt like they had some right to it. And this would come up later. When they conquered the hills with the artillery, they started bombarding the Russian ships from their own port. When the Russian ships tried to escape by going out, a number of them hit mines. Bottom line is the entire Pacific fleet of the Russian Empire was destroyed by the Japanese, those little yellow monkeys that Tsar Nicholas talked about. So, unbelievable. Nobody imagined. I mean, they were surprised when Japan defeated China, but when Japan defeated Russia in these battles, they thought that's unbelievable. And the person who could believe it least was Tsar Nicholas. And he was astonished. They said he was, any Canadians here, that he was gobsmacked when he found out that they had surprise attacked the fleet. And he complained because it was a surprise attack. The Japanese had not declared war. The Japanese calmly reminded them in 1809 Russia attacked Sweden without any declaration of war. Declaration of war was not made international law until 1907, 3 years after they did this at Port Arthur. So, because Tsar Nicholas was not going to take this lying down, he didn't know when to quit. There are two other major fleets. Of course, here we have Japan, there's Korea, Peninsula, etc. up here. So, the Russians also had a fleet in the Baltic Sea and one in the Black Sea. Well, the Black Sea fleet was sort of kind of pinned in because the Mediterranean powers didn't like it when the Black Sea fleet got out into the Mediterranean, so they decided to leave that alone. Nicholas ordered the Baltic fleet to leave the Baltic Sea and sail halfway around the world in order to try to defeat Japan. Because the Russians had offended Britain would not let them use the Suez Canal. They couldn't come this way, the shortcut. They had to sail all the way around Africa, and this was their route. Well, the Japanese intelligence was really excellent. They knew where they were the whole time. So the Japanese, as the Russian Baltic fleet, the second major fleet of the Russians, is approaching, they know exactly where they are, and they lie in wait in the Yellow Sea. When the Russian Baltic fleet, in a line, which is the way they convoy, the way they travel, started through the Tsushima Straits, which is the strait between Korea and Japan. The Japanese fleet was waiting for them. They crossed the T, if you know anything about military. That is, when the Russians are lined up this way, only the guns of the ship in front can fire. But the Japanese crossed the T, which meant every one of their ships could fire. They sank the second fleet of Russian ships. 2/3 of the Russian Navy has now been destroyed by this little country, Japan. At this point, Tsar Nicholas is pulling his hair out, and the American president, Teddy Roosevelt, offered to mediate a peace between the powers. And Nicholas jumped on that because at that point, Russia and the United States had good relations, and he thought, it's probably the best deal I'm going to get. Well, Teddy Roosevelt did negotiate peace, but he refused to allow Japan to demand any indemnity, any payment for things. And Japan really felt slighted by that. They thought they deserved some reparations from Russia. But Teddy Roosevelt sided with the Russians that they didn't have to pay any reparations to the Japanese. So, the seeds of this war, it's said that the Russo-Japanese War was perhaps the most important war in world history that no one has ever heard of. Because of Germany having aided Japan, Russia was mad at Germany, so they sided with the French, who were the German enemies. Remember who were on the same side in the First World War? Russia came in because France joined. You also have various other alliances. Japan got mad at the United States because felt they sided unfairly with Russia. So when the Second World War came along, or leading up to the Second World War, Japan felt they had reason not to trust America. A lot of the seeds of both the First and Second World War were planted here in the first decade of the 1900s, okay? Well, at this point, Japan has defeated Russia, so they go in and take over all of the properties that Russia had previously controlled in China. They enter into, this is an outline of what was known previously to this as Manchuria, a province of China. Well, the Japanese come in, take over a lot of the control of these areas, including the Aldol Peninsula down here, so that they've got the ports there. And over a period of time, they end up building more and more and more of an infrastructure there. In fact, the Russians had started building a railway line to reach down to the Aldol Peninsula, The Japanese took that over and finished building it, and they called it the South Manchurian Railway. They created a company to run it, and the South Manchurian Railway Company became the largest corporation in all of Asia because they started getting involved in mining, port control, various kinds of heavy industry, as well as rail. So they were richer than any other corporation in Asia, this Japanese company working in China. A lot of Japanese moved into the country in order to be able to work. And one of the weird things too was that the Japanese were all the white collar workers. They were the managers, they were the executives. The blue collar workers, the lower level workers, were all Chinese or Korean. And this increased this idea that the Japanese had that they were inherently superior. You know, they were just as bad as Tsar Nicholas with regard to an idea of racial superiority. So in 1931, they had an incident. Japan got tired of sort of saying, hey, we've got this huge corporation, we're doing all this work in somebody else's country, we want it to be our country. So in 1931, they staged an incident called the Mukden, which was a town at that point, the Mukden incident, in which a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army set off explosives near to, didn't actually damage, but near to the railway line of the South Manchurian Railway. And so, on that pretext, they claimed that the Chinese had done it. The Japanese send their whole army in there. They take over all of Manchuria, and within 6 months, they declare it to be the new country of Manchukuo. It's no longer Manchuria, it's Manchukuo, which is a client state, a puppet state of Japan. To make it even weirder, the Qing Empire of China has fallen by this time, and the last emperor of China was Puyi. They go and get Puyi, who is living a quiet life gardening, and bring him over to Manchukuo and make him the emperor of Manchukuo as a puppet to the Japanese. And so they now are controlling all of what had been Manchuria, and they begin from there expanding further. They begin to move down into other parts of China. The Chinese begin to resist this. They begin to fight back. And so you end up with the start in 1933-4 of major conflict. The Chinese, many of them moved to the west in order to get together to fight back. And this was the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. 1937 is when it's usually thought of as kicking off. Now in China, they refer to this as the 14-year war because they think 1931 is when it started at the Mukden incident, when they created Manchukuo. The Japanese came in. This area up here is what was controlled in China by the Japanese, and they ended up moving down later on. They take over Burma, Thailand, French Indochina, British Malaya, a lot of the other island groups. This is the rise of imperialism in Japan. There was a huge growth in almost a fascist militant nationalism, the idea that they were racially superior and they needed the resources, so they were simply going to take them. This was the beginning of the Second World War. But still today, the Second World War in China is called either the Sino-Japanese War, or it's also called the 14-year war, because they believe it started in 1931 and didn't end until September of 1945. There were more Japanese army in China, and this whole area is called the China-Burma-India Theater of the Second World War. We tend to think of the war against China as being the Pacific War, you know, the island hopping and all of that I'm going to talk about later on in some of the lectures. But in fact, there were more Japanese soldiers here, and at the end of the Second World War, the majority of the Japanese army was still undefeated. They were still on the continent in China. And this was one of the reasons why there was a great fear on the part of the Allies that if the Japanese decided that they were going to resist the invasion of the homelands, Japanese homeland, that they still had a huge army to do it with. Because we had defeated their navy, but their army was still intact. In fact, 39% of the Japanese military fatalities happened in China during this wartime. In the process of the Japanese beginning to take over parts of China, they were extraordinarily ruthless. In particular, and you probably have heard of this, when they took over the city of Nanking, which had been the capital, the nationalist capital of China. It had not been, Beijing had been the capital prior, but the nationalists, the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, had made Nanking their capital. Well, when Chiang Kai-shek and his soldiers departed, they abandoned Nanking. They left the people, the civilians there, and when the Japanese took it over because it had been the foreign capital, they devastated the city. They burnt most of it. Worse, they killed between, and the opinions vary widely on this from scholars, between 40,000 and 300,000 civilians were killed. As many as 80,000 women were raped. This is often called the Rape of Nanking. It was an extraordinary display of malicious atrocities. And today there's controversy about this among Japanese scholars and scholars from other nations in much the way there is about the Holocaust in Europe. The Holocaust deniers, there are people who deny the rape of Nanking in Japan, and it continues to be an issue that comes up in discussions between China and Japan in relationships. But there was quite horrific. There are soldiers, Japanese soldiers who were there who attest to the fact that this really did happen. At the same time that all this is going on, China is also involved in a civil war. In fact, from the time when China got rid of, in 1911, got rid of the Qing dynasty, we'll get into those details some this afternoon, there had been conflict between various parties within China, particularly the Nationalists, who were eventually led by Chiang Kai-shek, they were called the Kuomintang, and the Communist Party of China, the CPC. They had been fighting one another for a period of time when the Japanese had invaded for the Second Sino-Japanese War. The two parties, the Communists and the Nationalists, set aside their differences and presented a united front to fight against the Japanese, with the understanding that this was only until we got rid of them, then we'll start back, fighting each other again. There were still, even during the time when they were having a united front, there was still a lot of conflict between them. But between Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Communist Party, and Chiang Kai-shek, who was leader of the Nationalists, anti-communist, the country of China during this period of time was really, there were three different areas of control. There was the Chinese Nationalists, which is this larger area here, that controlled by the Japanese, and then this pink area was controlled by the Communists. Eventually, of course, the Communists ended up winning in controlling mainland China, but much of this kind of conflict was developed because the Japanese were trying to divide up China, control parts of it, and gain the resources they wanted from that. Of course, on August 6th of 1945, the Allies dropped the first nuclear weapon ever used on Hiroshima. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, they drop a second bomb on Nagasaki. That, along with a lot of other factors, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit later, led the emperor, which was unbelievable that this would happen, the emperor actually step in and give instructions to the military leaders of Japan that they were to surrender, to end the war. And there were any number of coups attempted in order to try to deny the emperor had said this or say he was under control and refuse to actually stop the war, but they were not successful. So the war ended. At the point at which the war between Japan and the Allies and Japan and China ended, the Civil War started back up again. The Chinese and the Nationalists ended up trying to use the time at the very end of the war to take over as much property as they could, and that battle continued. In 1949, Mao Zedong, the Communists, had been successful in conquering all of mainland China. Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists were forced to retreat to the island of Taiwan, and all of mainland China became Communist People's Republic of China. Taiwan became the Republic of China under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, and then others later, of course. And so that's where we end up with those two. But I'm going to talk about that in more detail this afternoon. And this is China as we see it today. Of course, you have Japan over here, North and South Korea. You've got the mainland of China, which is the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan, which is the Republic of China. So these three wars, the first Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, and the Second Sino-Japanese War were fundamental issues, not only in making determining what the political control and the geography and even the culture of these countries would be, but affected all of world history. Every other country in the West was affected by all of this as well. All right, I did that in 40 minutes. People tell me I should talk faster and I should get more in. Any questions about any of that? Is this helpful for you to understand, where all the conflict has been and how we ended up where we are? Any questions at all? Yes? Okay, I'm going to talk about, on the next cruise, I'll talk about the history of Korea as well, and in fact, the history of the Korean conflict. You remember I told you that the Russians, against the Japanese, claimed that they wanted to have a buffer state down to the 39th parallel. And so when the war ended, in much that, you remember Berlin got split up between the Allies and the Russians, right? Or between the Western powers and the Russians. The same thing happened in Korea. They agreed for a period of time, the United States would take over management of the southern part of the country, approximately one parallel off, but approximately the same place that the Russians had declared earlier. Instead of the 39th parallel, it became the 38th parallel. And both Russia and the United States said, we will do this for a period of time until everything settles down, and then we will leave. We will leave and let them be self-determining. Well, the US did that initially. The Russians refused. In fact, they kept moving more people in all the time, controlling it. In the South, they had free elections. There was a lot of corruption in the South. I'm not saying all that went perfectly, but in the North, the Russians influenced the development of their own election, and they elected communist leadership and set up a communist regime in the North, whereas in the South, they were, purportedly at least, although it didn't really work out that way with the first few people who were in charge in South Korea, they had a South Korean election of a democratic sort. So North and South Korea ended up being divided there because of the influence of communist Russia and the United States, much the way Berlin ended up being split for a long time. What's that? Well, this would have been after the Second World War, prior to the Korean War. In fact, the Korean War was, the North got tired of only having half the country, and the communist army of North Korea ended up invading the South. We'll talk about that. How many of you are going to be on the next leg of the cruise? Great. Well, I'll talk about the whole Korean conflict and the history of Korea at that point. Other questions? Yes?
So, what strategy did the communists use to defeat the nationalists?
Okay, what strategy did the communists use to defeat the nationalists? I'll talk about that a little bit this afternoon. It's a great question. Because for a long period of time, the nationalists, they were the government. They had all the army, they had all of the income, but they just messed it up. They allowed hyperinflation. They carried most of the weight of fighting against the Japanese, so that hurt them. The nationalists allowed rampant inflation, which destroyed people's savings, and more and more and more. And the communists, during the same time, they were getting the common people, the peasants, on their side. They would come in and make all kinds of promises, including they would take land away from the wealthy landowners and distribute it to the peasants. So over a period of time, the Nationalist Party, which was the anti-communist party, ended up offending pretty much everybody by allowing inflation. The economy was in the pits. They were not generous toward the people. There were atrocities committed by both sides. Whereas the Communist Party in China was effectively building, labor unions, women's organizations, youth organizations, getting the peasants on their side. And so it's sort of like the old Jesse James thing, where you can survive a long time if you can retreat to the local people and have them feed you and take care of you when the officials are after you. That's very much what the communists did. Until eventually they won, they got more and more. There were huge defections from the nationalist side to the communist side, because they just got tired of the way the nationalists were doing things. Much of the army, by the end of the Civil War, that were on the communist side had started out on the other side and then defected because of the way the nationalists were running things. To a lot of people, Chiang Kai-shek is a real hero because he was anti-communist. He did not do a very good job in terms of treating his people well enough for them to want to support him. Okay? Yes?
You showed that map of the massive imperial holdings of the army. They had spread all throughout this.
Right.
After the bombs were dropped on Japan, kind of a mass exodus or a mass recall and they left those countries and returned to Japan, or how long did that take?
So the question is, after the war ended, with all of the occupied territory that Japan had in China, what happened? Did they stay there? Did they go back to Japan? Most of them were repatriated. What happened is when the war ended, I'm reading a very good book right now called The Fall of Japan. And it's about exactly that. How did they resolve all those issues? You know, for instance, how did they retrieve prisoners of war so that some of the local Japanese military didn't kill them, etc. And much of it was that the Allies moved in and squashed everything in terms of any flare-ups that were happening. Plus the fact that for the first time ever, the emperor, who technically did not involve himself in day-to-day politics, he was seen as a divine being. The fact that he spoke up and he actually broadcast a recording telling his people to accept this, that as difficult as it was, accept the surrender, accept the fact that for us to continue as a nation, we have to give in to the Allies. And so much of it was either the Japanese accepted that and didn't fight back, and so they were willing to leave these areas, to leave control of them. Now, much of it too was that the communists and the nationalists between them, they were real quick to come in and want to take over this property, this territory that the Japanese had. And so, for the most part, the Japanese were kind of pushed out because the communist military and the nationalist military of China were both trying to take this property away from them anyway at that point. And so they ended up, most of them being repatriated. A lot of Japanese, just common citizens, stuck around, because there had always been a large population of Japanese in that part of China. It's very close, just as there has been in Korea. But for the most part, it was astonishing how peacefully they were able to make that massive change. Okay, other questions? Yes?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because in Western Europe, there was huge migration.
Mm-hmm.
Did that occur where they had hundreds of thousands of people on the roads coming?
So the question is, was there a massive migration, as there was in Europe, in the Second World War especially, massive movement of people during and after the war? They did have that in some of the cities, because there had been large populations in Shanghai, for instance, in Beijing. These are cities that the Japanese had attacked, particularly Shanghai and Nanking. And so they did have pretty quick and massive migration out of there. In fact, one of the stories that I'm just reading in this book I mentioned is that the astonishment that the Americans had when they landed and they were driving into some of the cities, and they were the only people driving into the cities, and there was a massive convoy of military trucks and other vehicles, even horse carts and things, leaving the cities and headed back toward the east. So it wasn't the kind of migration that you saw between countries as you did in Europe, because of course there was China and there was Japan, and so there weren't the kind of border displacements that there would have been otherwise. Yes?
So when the communists prevailed, what was the relationship like that at that period of time between the communists and the Russian government?
The Communist Party of China, the CPC, saw themselves as being inspired by the Russian Revolution. And they presented themselves as being a Leninist Marxist communism, the same way Russia was. One of the problems they had is that Stalin really did not like Mao, because he saw him as a potential competitor. And so Stalin initially, the USSR was supporting China against the Japanese. In fact, the day after the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki, USSR declared war on Japan. They had promised the Allies that as soon as the Western war was over against Germany, that they would fight Japan. And so the day after the dropping of the second bomb on Nagasaki, they declared war. The Japanese had been hoping that the Russians would come in and sort of protect them from the other Allies, but it didn't turn out that way. In fact, they always had the problem. The Japanese had to keep a major army there because they were afraid the Russians were going to come down. Remember, they'd beaten them in a war 40 years earlier. So there was a conflict inherent between the Russian leadership and the Chinese leadership. In fact, there was a period of time there in which Russia was providing aid both to the Communist Party of China and to the Nationalists. And that's one of the things that led to the split between the two, is because both of them were receiving aid in order to fight each other. And Russia wanted that. You know, Russia has always been in the business. Stalin's whole plan all along had been create warfare, and that allows us to take over, you know, and present communism as the alternative that people can have. And he was trying to do that in China as well. Even though they saw themselves as a Marxist-Leninist communist party, Stalin didn't care for them. And so the long term, the relationship did not work out very well. Back there.
Just north of Japan, there's two islands where Japan and Russia still
Are in conflict, yes.
battle. Can you describe that conflict style?
Well, that's going on even longer. The question was, in the very northern part of Japan, there are islands which are still in dispute between Russia and Japan. There are some that clearly are Japanese, Hokkaido and the northern end of Hokkaido, which is the northern major island of Japan, and then there are islands off that. And then islands, so Japan controls part of them clearly. Russia controls islands up there, clearly. There are some in between that are in dispute, and I think that's been going on forever. I think that's even before any of these wars were going on. It's just where two peoples come together. Because it's islands, the question is, where do you draw the line between them? So, but there's continues to be dispute over that. But there's not a whole lot of value in them, so they're not willing to go to war over it. Here first and then back there, yes?
Okay, so present day, China and Japan. We're seeing China buying utility companies and various companies all over the world. They're
Right.
creeping it everywhere. They're doing the same in Japan, or the Japanese are less?
You mean, are the Chinese buying in Japan?
Yes, but infrastructure, buying the gas companies, buying the water companies, buying the...
As much as they can. See, what happened is after the war, Japan had an astonishing economic revival. You know, they rebuilt and came back, and for ages, everything you looked at was made in Japan, right? Including all the cars, which is still pretty much true. Now, where's everything made? China. In the 90s, Japan suffered economically. You know, they plateaued and then dropped some. I mean, they're still basically healthy, but they're not the economic powerhouse that they were for several decades there, a couple decades there. China has grown economically. They have a special, they talk about China being market socialism. Or the official term in China is that it's socialism with a Chinese brand. Because they are a mixture now. They're no longer a forced economy. They now have an aspect of free market, but still they're a communist-controlled country. So they are buying up properties. I can't speak to how much they're doing that in Japan, but I don't think China, you know, they wouldn't say, no, we're not going to do that in Japan. I think they would take advantage of any opportunities they have. So, now back there, yes? How does Vietnam fit into all of that sort of conflict things? Vietnam is south, and of course they're part of the areas that Japan took over. It's much the same way. North Korea was influenced by the communists from the north that ended up eventually taking over the whole country, much as the Chinese communists did. So there was a lot of influence across the border, and there was a lot of control that was exerted during the Second World War over Vietnam and all of the area of French Indochina and all of that. But they're very independent. You know, they're not locked into it. It's not like they're a client state or anything of that sort. One more question. Anyone? Thank you very much. Oh, well, okay.
Just a comment. The son of Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Ching-kuo, was brought. His education was in Moscow,
Right.
which means that Stalin was good relation with Chiang Kai-shek.
Right. And again, the Russians under Stalin supported both the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists. The people in the West were tending to, you know, the democratic countries supporting the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek against the communists, and so to try to prevent the communist growth. But even America got fed up after a while, and when Chiang Kai-shek, late in the conflict of the Civil War, they appealed to America to please come in and mediate, you know, help us peace. America's response was we see no positive potential for that, and they basically just washed their hands of it. And all the West did. All right, thank you very much, and I will see you this afternoon at 4 o'clock, hopefully.